In the autumn of 1875, in the dense forests surrounding the logging settlement of Mill Creek, Illinois, three identical girls were born under circumstances so extraordinary that they would challenge everything the medical community thought they understood about human development, consciousness, and the very nature of individual identity. What began as an unusual birth would evolve into a mystery that defied scientific explanation and ultimately forced a family to choose between their children's safety and the world's burning curiosity about phenomena that seemed to transcend the laws of nature itself. The Harper triplets, Clara, Miriam, and Josephine, entered the world not as three separate individuals, but as what appeared to be a single consciousness distributed across three identical bodies. Their story would become one of the most documented yet least understood cases of human connection in American medical history, raising questions about identity, consciousness, and the mysterious forces that bind some people together in ways that science still struggles to comprehend. This is the tale of three girls who shared not just appearance, but thoughts, sensations, and experiences in ways that suggested they were parts of something larger than the sum of their individual selves. Their case would attract the attention of physicians, researchers, and curiosity seekers from across the country, ultimately forcing their family to make choices that would protect the children but leave countless questions forever unanswered. Before we dive into this account that challenges our understanding of individual identity and the boundaries of human consciousness, I need you to understand something important. This channel explores cases that push beyond conventional thinking about what it means to be a unique person, about the connections that can exist between people who share the same genetic material, and about phenomena that modern science is only beginning to acknowledge might be possible. If you're ready to confront mysteries that question our most basic assumptions about consciousness and individual identity, hit that subscribe button now and tell me in the comments what state you're listening from, because what happened to the Harper triplets might reveal patterns of human connection that exist much closer to your own family than you think. The story begins not with the extraordinary births themselves, but with the isolated world that would shape these remarkable children and the mother whose own mysterious nature may have contributed to their unusual gifts. Mill Creek, Illinois, in 1875, was a community built around the ancient forests that covered much of the state before settlement and agriculture transformed the landscape. The town existed primarily to harvest the massive oak, maple, firts, and hickory trees that logging companies needed to supply the growing cities of the Midwest with lumber for construction and fuel for heating. It was dangerous work that attracted men willing to risk their lives for wages that could support families, but it was also temporary work that would end when the forests were exhausted. The settlement consisted of perhaps 200 people living in rough cabins and boarding houses scattered along the muddy roads that connected the logging camps to the sawmill and the railroad depot. Most residents expected to move on when the trees were gone, but a few families had put down roots and were trying to build something permanent from what others saw as a temporary opportunity. Thomas Harper had come to Mill Creek in 1872, bringing skills as a blacksmith that made him essential to the logging operation's success. The massive saws, heavy equipment, and metal fittings used in timber harvesting required constant repair and maintenance, and Thomas's ability to work iron and steel made him one of the most valued men in the community. Unlike many of his neighbors, he had built a substantial house and seemed committed to staying in Mill Creek even after the logging was finished. His wife, Sarah, was a woman whose presence in the community raised questions that people whispered about but never asked directly. She had arrived in Mill Creek 6 months after Thomas, claiming to be his wife, though no one had witnessed their wedding or knew anything about her background. Sarah was beautiful in a way that made people uncomfortable, with dark hair and pale eyes that seemed to see more than they should, and she possessed knowledge about healing, herbs, and traditional remedies that suggested formal training or family traditions that she never discussed. Sarah could treat injuries and illnesses with remarkable success, using plants and techniques that the community's occasional visiting doctor didn't recognize, but couldn't argue with when they produced results. She could stop bleeding with the touch of her hands, reduce fevers with teas brewed from wild plants, and calm hysterical patients with words spoken in languages that sounded like no dialect anyone had ever heard. But Sarah's most unsettling characteristic was her apparent ability to know things about people that they hadn't told her. She would prepare remedies for illnesses before symptoms appeared. She would comfort women about pregnancy concerns before they had shared their worries. And she would sometimes speak to people about events in their past that they had never discussed with anyone in Mill Creek. The Harper house sat on a hill overlooking the main logging operation, a two-story structure built from timber that Thomas had selected personally and finished with craftsmanship that demonstrated both skill and pride. The house was larger than most in Mill Creek and was furnished with items that suggested the Harpers had more resources than Thomas's blacksmith wages should have provided. Behind the Harper home, Sarah kept a sprawling garden where she grew vegetables for her family and cultivated medicinal herbs used in the remedies that had made her the community's unofficial healer. Under her care, the garden seemed to flourish beyond all reason, producing crops far more abundant and varied than the soil and climate should have allowed. Neighbors often remarked that her plants appeared to respond to her presence in ways that defied ordinary gardening skill. Vegetables swelled to unusual sizes when she worked among them. Flowers bloomed out of season under her touch, and even wild plants thrived in places where she spent time. Some chalked it up to rare talent and deep knowledge. Others quietly suggested influences that were not entirely natural. In the spring of 1875, Sarah became pregnant, and from the very start, her condition was marked by strange occurrences that unsettled even her staunchest supporters. She experienced none of the usual discomforts, no morning sickness, no fatigue, and continued her work without limitation. Far from draining her, the pregnancy seemed to energize her, allowing her to tend her garden and treat neighbors right up until the day labor began. The most peculiar part of it all was Sarah's habit of speaking to the unborn child, or rather, children. She would rest her hands on her belly and speak to Clara about one matter, then turn her attention to Miriam for another, and finally consult Josephine about something entirely different. When asked about these conversations, she would only smile and say her daughters had much to share about the world they were soon to enter. During the final weeks, Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, the settlement's most seasoned midwife, took over Sarah's care and quickly found herself facing a case unlike any she had known. Sarah insisted she was carrying 3 identical daughters who would each be born at precise times within a single day. Mrs. Morrison could only detect one heartbeat and feel the movements of a single child. But Sarah's unwavering certainty began to make the midwife wonder whether there was more to this pregnancy than she could explain. Sarah's predictions about the birth were too specific, her knowledge too unusual to dismiss as mere imagination. Labor began at dawn on September 15, 1875, under atmospheric conditions that made the entire town of Mill Creek uneasy. The air hung unnaturally still, with none of the usual forest sounds, no bird song, no insect hum, not even the rustle of leaves. The sky was perfectly clear, but strangely radiant, as if lit from within by a source unrelated to the rising sun. At exactly 6 a.m., Clara Harper entered the world after less than an hour of smooth, uncomplicated labor, so quick that Mrs. Morrison had barely finished her preparations. The child was healthy and well-formed, weighing about 6 pounds, with dark hair and pale, unusual eyes. Most striking was the intricate pattern of birthmarks on her left shoulder, shapes that seemed almost like letters or symbols from some unknown script. Then the birth process stopped completely. The contractions vanished as if someone had turned a key and locked them away. Sarah lay alert and comfortable, her body still full and visibly pregnant. Mrs. Morrison could feel movement inside, signs of more babies, but there was no progression toward delivery. "I've never seen anything like it," she later confided to her husband. "The baby came into the world just fine, but Sarah's body is behaving as though she's still carrying her. The labor simply paused." Sarah seemed completely unconcerned by the unusual situation, holding Clara and nursing her while calmly announcing that Miriam would arrive at noon and Josephine would be born just before sunset. Mrs. Morrison remained at the Harper house, torn between professional skepticism and growing certainty that she was witnessing something that defied medical explanation. Thomas Harper paced anxiously through the house, trying to understand what was happening to his wife and family. As a practical man who worked with tangible materials and physical processes, he struggled to accept Sarah's claims about staggered births, but he had learned over the years that his wife's predictions were usually accurate, even when they seemed impossible. At exactly 12 p.m., Sarah's labor resumed with the same intensity and efficiency that had characterized Clara's birth. Miriam Harper was born after less than 30 minutes of contractions, appearing to be identical to her sister in every detail, including the complex birthmarks on her left shoulder. But again, Sarah's labor stopped immediately after the delivery, leaving her body in the same pregnant state despite having now delivered 2 babies. Morrison examined Miriam carefully and found that she was identical to Clara, not just in general appearance, but in specific details that should have varied between even identical twins. The pattern of birthmarks was exactly the same. The facial features were mirror images rather than similar approximations, and even tiny details like the shape of fingernails and the curl of hair matched precisely. "It's as if the same baby was born twice," Mrs. Morrison confided to Thomas during the afternoon lull between births. "I've delivered dozens of twins over the years, and even identical ones show small differences that distinguish them from each other. But these 2 girls are exactly the same, in ways that don't seem natural." Throughout the afternoon, Clara and Miriam displayed synchronized behavior that troubled everyone who observed them. They would cry at exactly the same moments, sleep and wake in perfect coordination, and even nurse at identical intervals despite being held by different people. When one baby was uncomfortable, both would show signs of distress until the problem was resolved for whichever child was actually affected. Josephine Harper arrived at exactly 6 p.m., just as the sun was setting behind the western hills. Her birth completed the pattern that Sarah had predicted, occurring with the same ease and efficiency that had characterized her sister's deliveries. Like Clara and Miriam, Josephine appeared to be an exact duplicate of her siblings, complete with identical birthmarks and synchronized behaviors. Mrs. Morrison completed the medical procedures that followed the triple birth, ensuring that all 3 babies and their mother were healthy and stable. But she also documented phenomena that challenged her understanding of normal infant development and sibling relationships. The 3 infants appear to function as parts of a single organism rather than as separate individuals, Mrs. Morrison wrote in her private journal. "They sleep, wake, feed, and respond to stimuli in perfect synchronization, as if controlled by a shared nervous system. When I examine one baby, the other 2 react as if they are experiencing the same sensations." Thomas held his 3 daughters for the first time that evening, marveling at their identical appearance while struggling to understand the implications of their unusual connection. Each baby seemed to respond not just to his touch and voice, but to his interactions with her sisters, creating an awareness that extended beyond individual perception. "They're beautiful," Thomas said to Sarah, as he looked down at the 3 sleeping infants. "But there's something about them that I don't understand. It's like they're the same person living in 3 bodies. Is that normal for triplets?" Sarah smiled as she watched her husband trying to comprehend what they had brought into the world. "They're not like other children," she said simply. "There's something special, something that doesn't happen very often. We'll need to be careful about how we raise them and who we allow to know about their gifts." Word of the unusual triple birth spread quickly through the small community of Mill Creek, attracting visitors who came to see the identical triplets for themselves. Most were simply curious about the rare phenomenon of three identical babies, but a few recognized that something extraordinary was happening with the Harper children. Dr. William Patterson, who served several logging communities throughout the region, made a special trip to examine the triplets when he heard reports of their unusual behavior. His findings, documented in detailed medical notes, revealed characteristics that he had never encountered in his 20 years of medical practice. The Harper triplets display physiological synchronization that exceeds anything reported in medical literature about multiple births, Dr. Patterson wrote. Their heart rates, breathing patterns, and sleep cycles are perfectly coordinated, suggesting nervous system connections that transcend normal sibling relationships. When I test reflexes in one infant, the other two show identical responses despite receiving no direct stimulation. Dr. Patterson also noted that the triplets seemed to share sensory experiences in ways that defied medical explanation. When he applied mild stimuli to one baby, all three would react as if they had received the same treatment. When he spoke to one infant, all three would turn toward his voice simultaneously, even when the other two were positioned where they couldn't see him. As the triplets grew from infants to toddlers, their synchronized behavior became more pronounced and more complex. They learned to walk on the same day, spoke their first words simultaneously, and developed identical preferences in food, activities, and interactions with other people. But most remarkably, they seemed to communicate with each other through methods that had no visible or audible components. Clara, Miriam, and Josephine would often pause in the middle of activities and appear to consult with each other through glances and subtle gestures before resuming their play or changing to different activities. They would coordinate their actions without speaking, respond to each other's needs without being asked, and demonstrate knowledge of events and information that only one of them had experienced directly. Mrs. Morrison continued to monitor the triplets' development and documented abilities that challenged her understanding of child psychology and sibling relationships. The girls seemed to function as a collective entity that could distribute tasks and knowledge among its three components while maintaining perfect coordination of goals and activities. When the Harper girls play together, it's like watching a single child who happens to occupy three bodies, Mrs. Morrison observed. They never argue or compete with each other because they seem to share the same thoughts and desires, but they also divide responsibilities among themselves in ways that suggest sophisticated planning and communication that occurs without words. By the time the triplets reached their third birthday, their reputation had spread beyond Mill Creek to attract attention from physicians and researchers throughout Illinois and neighboring states. Reports of their synchronized behavior and apparent shared consciousness had reached medical schools and scientific societies that were eager to study what appeared to be an unprecedented case of human development. Dr. Marcus Webb, a specialist in nervous system disorders from the University of Chicago, visited Mill Creek in 1878 to examine the triplets and document their unusual characteristics. His investigation, conducted over several days, revealed phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about individual consciousness and the boundaries between separate human beings. The Harper triplets demonstrate what appears to be a distributed consciousness that operates through three separate bodies while maintaining unified awareness and decision-making capabilities, Dr. Webb wrote in his preliminary report. They share sensory experiences, emotional states and apparently even thoughts in ways that suggest their nervous systems are connected through mechanisms unknown to current medical science. Dr. Webb's examination included tests designed to determine whether the triplets were communicating through subtle visual or auditory cues that normal observers might miss. He separated them into different rooms and monitored their responses to various stimuli, discovering that reactions occurred simultaneously, regardless of physical proximity or possibility of normal sensory communication. When Dr. Webb applied mild electrical stimulation to Clara's hand while she was isolated from her sisters, Miriam and Josephine both cried out and grabbed their own hands at exactly the same moment, despite being in separate rooms with no possible way to know what was happening to their sister. Similar results occurred when any of the three was subjected to unexpected stimuli, suggesting that they truly shared sensory experiences across physical separation. The doctor also discovered that the triplets could coordinate complex activities even when they couldn't see or hear each other. He gave Clara a puzzle to solve while keeping Miriam and Josephine in different rooms, then observed as all three girls worked on imaginary versions of the same puzzle, making identical moves and reaching the solution simultaneously. The subjects appear to share not just sensory experiences, but cognitive processes as well, Dr. Webb documented. They seem to think collectively, while maintaining the ability to process information and solve problems through distributed mental activity that operates across three separate brains. As word of Dr. Webb's findings spread through the medical community, the Harper family began receiving visits from physicians, researchers, and curiosity seekers who wanted to observe the triplets for themselves. Some came with scientific interest in understanding how their shared consciousness functioned, while others were simply fascinated by reports of children who appeared to possess supernatural abilities. Sarah Harper became increasingly protective of her daughters as outside attention intensified, limiting access to researchers and refusing to allow invasive testing that might distress the children or interfere with their normal development. She understood better than anyone else the extraordinary nature of what her daughters represented, and she was determined to shield them from exploitation by people who might not have their best interests at heart. But the scientific community's interest in the triplets continued to grow, fueled by Dr. Webb's reports and similar accounts from other physicians who had observed the children. Medical journals published articles about the case, and universities began developing research proposals for comprehensive studies that would investigate the mechanisms behind the girls' shared consciousness. The pressure for more extensive scientific investigation reached a critical point in the summer of 1879, when representatives from several medical schools and research institutions visited Mill Creek to request permission for long-term studies of the triplets. The proposed research would involve separating the girls to test the limits of their connection, conducting invasive medical procedures to examine their nervous systems, and potentially removing them from their family for extended periods of institutional study. Dr. James Patterson from Harvard Medical School presented the most comprehensive research proposal, outlining a multi-year study that would involve detailed neurological examinations, psychological testing, and controlled separation experiments designed to understand how the triplets' shared consciousness functioned. "Hello, my darling," Marjorie whispered to the baby. "I knew you would come back to me. I knew you weren't really gone." Robert entered the room to find his wife conscious and alert, holding a baby who appeared to be the exact same daughter they had buried 10 days earlier. His emotions overwhelmed him as he struggled to understand what he was witnessing, torn between joy at having his family restored and confusion about the impossible nature of what had occurred. Dr. Morrison examined both mother and child extensively, searching for any medical explanation for what he had witnessed. Marjorie showed no signs of having been critically ill just hours earlier, and the baby displayed all the characteristics of a healthy newborn. But the doctor could find no rational way to explain how a woman could give birth to the same child twice, or how a dead infant could return to life. "My daughters are not laboratory specimens," Sarah told Dr. Patterson firmly. "They're children who deserve to grow up in a loving family environment, not test subjects to be studied and experimented upon. Whatever gifts they possess, they'll learn to use them in their own time and their own way." But the scientific pressure continued to mount as reports of the triplets spread to national publications and international medical journals. The case attracted attention from researchers throughout Europe and America, who argued that the children represented a phenomenon too important to remain unstudied. The situation became untenable in the autumn of 1879 when government representatives arrived in Mill Creek with legal documents suggesting that the triplets could be declared wards of the state and removed from their family for scientific study in the national interest. While the legal authority for such action was questionable, the threat was serious enough to convince Sarah and Thomas that their daughters were in danger from people who viewed them as curiosities rather than children. The decision to leave Mill Creek was made quickly and implemented with secrecy that prevented outside interference. In November 1879, the Harper family disappeared from the community during a single night, taking only essential possessions and leaving no indication of their destination or future plans. Mrs. Morrison, who had maintained a close relationship with the family since the triplets' birth, later revealed that Sarah had confided her plans for the family's departure, but had sworn her to secrecy about their destination. The midwife knew that the Harpers had left Illinois, but would never reveal where they had gone or how they could be contacted. Sarah was right to protect her daughters from people who wanted to treat them like scientific specimens. Mrs. Morrison told curious visitors, who continued to arrive in Mill Creek long after the family's departure, those children needed love and normal family life, not examination and experimentation by researchers who saw them as opportunities for fame and recognition. The Harper house stood empty for several months after the family's departure, becoming a pilgrimage site for researchers and curiosity seekers who hoped to find clues about the triplets' whereabouts or evidence that might explain their unusual abilities. But the family had been thorough in removing all traces of their presence, leaving behind only the memories of those who had witnessed their daughter's extraordinary gifts. Webb published a comprehensive report on his examination of the Harper triplets in the American Journal of Medical Science, documenting their synchronized behavior and apparent shared consciousness, while acknowledging that his research had been cut short by the family's disappearance. His paper became one of the most cited articles in early neurological literature, establishing the Harper case as a landmark in the study of consciousness and individual identity. The Harper triplets demonstrated that human consciousness may be capable of distribution across multiple individuals in ways that challenge our fundamental assumptions about the nature of identity and awareness. Dr. Webb concluded in his report, their case suggests that the boundaries between separate human beings may be more fluid than previously understood, and that consciousness itself may operate according to principles that current science has yet to discover. The disappearance of the Harper family marked the end of direct scientific observation of the triplets, but their case continued to influence medical research and philosophical discussions about the nature of consciousness for decades afterward. The detailed records kept by Mrs. Morrison, Dr. Webb, and other observers provided a foundation for theoretical work that explored the implications of shared consciousness and distributed identity. Sightings of the Harper family were reported from various locations throughout the Midwest and West during the years following their departure from Mill Creek, but none were confirmed, and the family's ultimate fate remained unknown. Some reports suggested that they had settled in remote communities where their daughter's unusual abilities would attract less attention, while others claimed that the triplets had learned to suppress their synchronized behavior to avoid detection. The most persistent rumors suggested that the Harper triplets had grown into women who used their shared consciousness for purposes that served the common good. working together in ways that allowed them to accomplish things that individual people could not achieve alone. These accounts described the adult triplets as teachers, healers, or social workers who operated in different locations but coordinated their efforts through their continuing mental connection. Mrs. Morrison preserved detailed records of her observations of the Harper triplets, from birth through their departure from Mill Creek, creating a document that became one of the most important sources of information about early childhood development in cases of apparent shared consciousness. Her journal was eventually donated to the Illinois Historical Society, where it remains available to researchers studying unusual psychological phenomena. Modern researchers who have studied the Harper case note several characteristics that distinguish it from other reported instances of synchronized behavior in twins or triplets. The Harper girls demonstrated not just similar responses to stimuli, but actually shared sensory experiences, suggesting nervous system connections that transcended normal genetic similarities between siblings. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neurologist at Northwestern University who has studied historical cases of shared consciousness, believes the Harper triplets may have represented an extreme example of neural connectivity that occurs rarely in multiple birth situations. Her research suggests that certain genetic and developmental factors might occasionally create conditions that allow for shared consciousness between closely related individuals. The Harper case describes phenomena that are theoretically possible based on our current understanding of neural development and genetic expression, Dr. Chen explains. While such extreme cases are extraordinarily rare, they might occur when specific genetic variations combine with unique developmental circumstances to create nervous system connections that transcend individual boundaries. The logging community of Mill Creek disappeared in the 1890s when the surrounding forests were exhausted and the economic base for the settlement no longer existed. The Harper house was abandoned along with the rest of the town, eventually collapsing and returning to the forest that had briefly been cleared for human habitation. But visitors to the area where Mill Creek once stood occasionally report unusual experiences that suggest the Harper triplets' presence may have left lasting effects on the location where they spent their early years. Some describe hearing the sound of children playing in areas where no children are present, seeing three identical figures moving through the trees, and experiencing sudden sensations of shared awareness that feel like echoes of the girls' remarkable connection. Whether these phenomena are related to the Harper triplets' story or simply the result of suggestion and local folklore, they serve as reminders that some aspects of human consciousness and identity may remain beyond our current ability to understand or explain. The case of the Harper triplets continues to influence research into consciousness, identity, and the nature of human awareness more than a century after their disappearance. Their story challenges our assumptions about individual identity and suggests that the boundaries between separate people may be more fluid than we have traditionally believed. For researchers studying consciousness and neural connectivity, the Harper case provides historical evidence that shared awareness between multiple individuals may be possible under certain circumstances. While the mechanisms behind such phenomena remain mysterious, the detailed observations of the triplets' behavior offer insights into how consciousness might operate when distributed across multiple bodies. The philosophical implications of the Harper case extend far beyond medical science to questions about the nature of personal identity and individual existence. If consciousness can indeed be shared between multiple people, what does that mean for our understanding of what it means to be a unique individual? How do we define personal identity when thoughts, feelings, and experiences can be distributed among several bodies? These questions become particularly relevant as modern neuroscience begins to develop technologies that might eventually allow for artificial connections between human brains. The Harper triplets' natural shared consciousness provides a historical example of what such connections might look like and how they might affect human experience and identity. The story of Clara, Miriam, and Josephine Harper also serves as a reminder that scientific curiosity must be balanced with respect for individual rights and human dignity. Their family's decision to protect them from intrusive research was ultimately vindicated by changing attitudes about the ethics of human experimentation and the rights of children to be protected from exploitation. Modern research into consciousness and neural connectivity is conducted with strict ethical guidelines that prioritize the welfare of research subjects over scientific curiosity. The Harper case played an important role in developing these standards by demonstrating the potential for harm when scientific interest overrides concern for human welfare. The triplets who science couldn't explain have left us with questions about consciousness, identity, and human connection that may take generations to answer. But their story serves as a powerful reminder that human experience may be far more complex and wonderful than we have imagined, and that the deepest mysteries of existence may be hidden in the connections between people who share bonds that transcend individual identity. Whether Clara, Miriam, and Josephine Harper truly shared consciousness through mechanisms that science has yet to discover, or whether their synchronized behavior resulted from factors that we still don't understand, their case continues to challenge our assumptions about what it means to be human and what kinds of connections are possible between people who share the deepest bonds of family and genetic heritage. The mother who gave birth to 3 identical daughters who functioned as one consciousness, distributed across 3 bodies, has left us with a mystery that touches on the very nature of human existence. Their story suggests that the boundaries between individual people may be more permeable than we have believed, and that consciousness itself may operate according to principles that our current science can barely imagine.